When you turn on the news or just scroll through your phone, it really feels like, well, like the world's just getting more violent, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. That feeling is very common. Conflict everywhere, danger.
Yeah, exactly. Like we're in this, I don't know, unprecedented time of aggression, antisocial stuff. But what if that feeling, that gut reaction is just wrong?
It's a fascinating thought, isn't it?
Yeah.
What if the reality, the actual data, points in the opposite direction?
And that's precisely what we're going to dig into today. We've got this collection of sources, research, articles, notes you sent over, and we want to really unpack the roots of aggression, violence, all these antisocial behaviors.
Yeah, try and get to the bottom of it. The mission, really, is to pull out the key insights. We're talking definitions, historical trends, maybe some surprising things like, environment, diet.
In posture and how culture sort of tries to step in and manage it all.
Right. It's like understanding the push towards conflict and then the pullback from it that culture provides,
Mm.
often in ways we don't even notice.
Okay, so first things first, we need to get the terms straight. Aggression, violence, antisocial behavior. They sound similar, but the sources are pretty specific, right?
Very specific, especially in psychology. So aggression, the definition really hinges on intent. It's any behavior intended to harm someone who doesn't want to be harmed.
Intent. Okay, so if I accidentally knock your coffee over, that's clumsy, not aggressive.
Exactly. But if I, deliberately shove you, hoping you'll spill your coffee,
Eh,
even if you manage to catch it.
That is aggression because I meant to cause harm or at least annoyance.
Precisely. Intent is key. Now, violence is a subset of aggression.
Okay.
It's aggression where the goal is extreme physical harm, think serious injury or
Yeah,
death.
right. So yelling insults, that's aggressive, but it's not violent.
Correct. But say punching someone or worse, that's both aggressive and violent.
Makes sense. So all violence is aggression, but you can be aggressive without being violent. Like spreading nasty rumors. That's intended to harm someone's reputation.
Exactly. That's harm, but not physical violence. And then you've got the big umbrella term, antisocial behavior.
Which covers more ground.
Yeah, it's anything that harms relationships or is just
Hey.
culturally undesirable. Aggression fits, obviously. But so does lying, cheating, stealing, even littering.
Huh. Littering is antisocial. I guess it is. It damages the shared environment, so you don't have to be aggressive to be antisocial.
Not at all. The sources also talk about different forms of aggression.
Like physical versus verbal. That seems straightforward.
That and also direct versus indirect aggression. Direct is, face-to-face. Punching, insulting someone right there
And indirect.
is when the victim isn't present, like
Yeah.
spreading those rumors or maybe damaging their property when they're not around.
Ah, okay. And this indirect type, sometimes called relational aggression, is maybe more common with girls or women, while direct physical stuff is more associated with guys.
That's the general pattern that research points
Mm.
to, yeah. Especially with physical aggression in young men. We can definitely circle back to age and gender.
And the motivation behind it matters too. You've got reactive versus proactive.
Right. Reactive aggression is the hot kind. Impulsive, angry, usually a response to feeling provoked or threatened. It's
Well,
emotional,
like snapping at someone in traffic.
pretty much.
Mm.
Whereas proactive aggression, that's cold,
Yeah.
it's calculated, planned. It's aggression used as a tool to get something else.
Like a robbery
Okay.
or a hitman.
Exactly. The harm isn't the main point. It's instrumental to achieving another goal.
Okay, reactive is feeling driven, proactive is goal driven. Where does something like bullying fit in?
Bullying is defined by being persistent. It's repeated aggression, often by someone stronger or a group aimed at establishing dominance over the victim. It's that power imbalance in repetition.
And cyberbullying is just doing that online.
Basically, yeah, using the internet, phones, whatever.
Mhm.
And the anonymity factor online can make it particularly nasty and hard to escape.
Right.
Okay, definitions sorted. Aggression needs intent. Violence is extreme physical harm. Antisocial is broader. And aggression takes different forms with different motives. So, let's tackle that big idea from the start. Is the world really less violent? Because it sure doesn't feel that way.
It really doesn't. And that feeling is largely down to the news. If it bleeds, it leads, right? Violent, dramatic stories get way more airtime.
And we remember them more easily.
Exactly. That's the availability heuristic. Things that are easy to recall seem more common than they actually are, with 247 news and social media showing violence from everywhere.
It feels like it's constant and increasing. Our perception gets skewed. But what does the historical data in the sources actually show?
Well, it's pretty compelling looking across different timescales. Archaeological evidence, quantitative studies, they suggest prehistoric societies were far more violent than ours.
More violent. How do they figure that out? Things like skeletal remains showing trauma, but also estimates of death rates in conflicts. Per person involved, death rates in tribal warfare seem to have been much higher than in modern wars.
Wow. Higher than World War I or II, proportionally. That's hard to grasp.
It is. One estimate mentioned suggests that if 20th century wars had the same death rate per capita as ancient tribal conflicts, the death toll would have been like 2 billion, not the 100 million or so that it was.
2 billion. Okay, that definitely challenges the idea that we're inherently getting worse.
Right. And then look at more recent history. Europe, since the Middle Ages, the data shows a really dramatic fall in murder rates.
Like that England example.
Yeah, England's estimated murder rate fell from maybe 24 per 100,000 people back in the 14th century, way down to around 0.6 per 100,000 by the 1960s. That's a huge drop.
And a big part of that drop happened around the 17th century, the Age of Reason.
Seems to be a key period, yeah. Suggests maybe a cultural shift was underway. And globally, since World War II, the trends generally point downwards too. Fewer battle deaths, fewer armed conflicts overall, fewer military coups, fewer campaigns targeting civilians.
And thinkers like Steven Pinker argue that stuff we find abhorrent now, like, public torture for entertainment, slavery being normal, wiping out groups just for their land, that was just Tuesday for most of human history.
Exactly. Things that were commonplace are now rare, or at least widely condemned, especially in the West. The sources use this long-term trend as evidence for a core idea.
That culture's main job is to reduce violence.
Pretty much. In the animal world, if two individuals want the same thing, fighting might be the default. But human culture develops alternatives. Negotiation, laws, property rights, moral codes, compromise, ways to settle disputes without resorting to violence.
So it's that theme. Nature might provide the capacity for aggression, maybe even says go sometimes.
But culture overwhelmingly tries to say stop. Or at least, hang on, let's try this other way first.
Culture as the brake. So obviously it doesn't always work, especially between different cultures or when things break down internally.
Of course. But the trend within developing societies seems to be towards finding nonviolent solutions.
Which brings us right to that fundamental question. Is aggression innate, something we're born with, or is it learned? Nature versus nurture.
The classic debate. Historically, you had strong instinct theories. Darwin saw it as adaptive for survival, mating.
Nature's toolkit.
And Freud had his death instinct, thanatos. This idea that aggressive energy builds up like steam in a kettle and needs release. A hydraulic model.
Does that hold water, metaphorically speaking?
Well, the sources say there's not much empirical support for that specific hydraulic model in humans. The idea that you have to vent aggression or you'll explode. We do see innate aggressive responses in some animals, like stickleback fish attacking red things.
Right.
But there's no single automatic trigger like that for complex aggression in humans.
Okay, so maybe not a simple instinct. What about learning theories?
Big one there is Bandura's social learning theory. Argues we learn aggression through direct experience, like getting rewarded for it, but also, crucially, just by watching others, modeling.
Ah, the Bobo doll study. I remember that from Psych 101.
Exactly. Kids watched an adult punch and kick this inflatable doll.
And then the kids did the same thing when they got the chance, even copied specific actions and words.
Yeah, even if they just saw it on film. It was powerful evidence. But the sources are careful here. It doesn't necessarily prove aggression is only learned.
What does it show then?
It shows that observing aggression can lower inhibitions. It teaches you that maybe aggression is okay, or effective, or expected in this situation. The impulse might be there already, but modeling shows you how and when to express it, overcoming the stop message.
Okay, that makes sense as a kind of middle ground. The capacity for aggression might be natural, an innate response to certain things like threats or frustration. Nature says go.
But culture, through socialization and learning, teaches us how to control that impulse, how to manage it, what the rules are. Culture says stop.
And the fact that violence has decreased over the long haul suggests that culture's stop message has been sort of winning out over time.
That's the argument presented, yes. The nonviolent person isn't necessarily someone without aggressive impulses, but someone who has learned effective ways, largely through culture, to manage and restrain those impulses.
So it's less about the feeling itself and more about the complex web of factors that determine if that feeling leads to action. Let's dive into those factors. What are the specific causes of aggression the sources highlight? Starting with inner causes.
Right, things inside us. A big one is frustration. The original frustration-aggression hypothesis back in 1939 was super strong. Claimed frustration always causes aggression, and aggression always stems from frustration.
Always. That sounds unlikely.
Yeah, modern psychology tends to avoid always. That strong version is debated. But there's no doubt frustration increases the likelihood of aggression. It's a major trigger.
The Rwanda genocide example comes up here, right? The idea that long-standing Hutu frustration over perceived inequalities with the Tutsi minority whipped up by propaganda.
Yes, that deep-seated frustration and resentment provided fertile ground, a context for the horrific violence that erupted, although obviously it doesn't excuse it. It's a complex interplay.
And it's not just specific frustrations. The sources say just being in a bad mood can fuel aggression.
That's right. Research by Berkowitz and others suggests pretty much any strong negative feeling, anger, pain, irritation, not just frustration, can lower the threshold for aggression. If researchers want to provoke aggression in a lab study, putting people in a bad mood is a reliable way to do it.
Though you mentioned guilt is an exception.
Correct. Guilt seems different. It usually motivates apologies or attempts to make amends. Pro-social stuff, not aggression.
So why do bad moods often lead to lashing out? Is it that venting idea? Catharsis?
Yeah, that's one theory, that people aggress because they think it'll make them feel better. But the research on whether venting anger actually works long-term is, well, it's mixed at best. Often it just seems to keep the anger going.
What about excitation transfer? The bike study.
Yeah, that's a fascinating one. It's when arousal from one source, like, say, vigorously riding an exercise bike, carries over and makes your reaction to something else stronger.
So you're physically revved up from the exercise.
And then someone provokes you. Your body's still aroused, but you mistakenly attribute that feeling entirely to the provocation, making you feel more angry and react more aggressively than you would have otherwise. The study found people who exercised then got provoked were the most aggressive.
So your body's physiological state can get mislabeled as intense emotion. But being in a bad mood or aroused doesn't guarantee aggression, right?
Definitely not. They're not necessary. Nor are they sufficient on their own. They're risk factors. They make aggression more likely, especially when other triggers are present.
Okay. What about how we think? The sources mention hostile cognitive biases. This is like seeing the world through angry glasses.
Pretty much. Aggressive people often have these systematic biases in how they interpret social information. There's hostile attribution bias.
Where you assume people mean harm.
Exactly. Someone bumps into you accidentally, you immediately think they did that on purpose. No benefit of the doubt.
Okay.
Then there's hostile perception bias. That's seeing aggression even in neutral situations. Like you see two people talking animatedly and you assume they must be fighting.
Instead of just excited or passionate.
Right. And finally, hostile expectation bias. This is where you expect others to react aggressively to disagreements or provocations.
So you expect a fight.
Yeah. And if you expect it, you might act defensively or aggressively first, which then causes the other person to react badly, confirming your expectation. It's a vicious cycle. The sources note playing violent video games seems to increase this specific bias. These biases really get in the way of peaceful resolutions.
You see hostility, you expect hostility, you act hostile, you get hostility back. Ugh. Okay, last internal factor mentioned, age and gender.
And here the pattern is incredibly consistent across cultures and history.
Young men.
Young adult men, roughly age 15 to 30. They commit the vast majority of violent crimes worldwide. Violence peaks in this demographic and then drops off significantly.
And the gender difference starts early.
Seems to. Even among toddlers and preschoolers, boys tend to show more physical aggression. As they grow, girls often shift more towards indirect or relational aggression, social exclusion, rumors, while boys continue with higher rates of physical aggression. The gap becomes enormous for serious violent crime in young adulthood. You just don't find societies where women are the main perpetrators of violence.
Any idea why? Nature or nurture again?
The universality strongly suggests a biological component. Evolutionary theories often point to male competition for status and mates. Historically, success for males might have been more linked to physical dominance and aggression, especially against rivals. Some studies even show that just thinking about sex can make men more aggressive towards other men.
Interesting. But women do use physical aggression sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. And studies looking at violence within couples actually show women initiate physical aggression slightly more often than men.
Really? That's surprising.
It is, but the crucial difference is the outcome. Because men are typically larger and stronger, they inflict far more serious injuries and are responsible for the vast majority of domestic homicides. And again, women tend to use more relational aggression.
Okay, so a complex mix of internal factors. Let's move to interpersonal causes aggression between people. The sources talk about aggression as social influence or even just selfishness.
Yeah, this view frames aggression less as pure rage and more as a strategy. A tool people use, consciously or not, to get what they want from others, resolve disputes in their favor, or assert dominance.
Based on the idea that humans have a fundamentally selfish core driven by evolution.
That's part of the argument. Survival and reproduction often prioritize self-interest. When two self-interested individuals want the same thing, conflict arises. And aggression is a very direct, albeit often destructive way to try and win that conflict.
Whether someone actually uses it depends on things like how badly they want the thing.
Right, and whether they think aggression will work. Like if they don't expect the other person to fight back effectively.
And their own moral compass, their inhibitions.
Exactly. High motivation, high perceived chance of success, low moral inhibition. That makes using aggression as a social strategy more likely. This perspective is useful when looking at things like domestic violence.
Violence within families or relationships. You mentioned sibling aggression is actually the most common type.
Statistically, yes. Lots of conflict there. But focusing on intimate partner violence, the sources highlight some stark realities, mentioning high rates in South Africa, for instance, particularly for women, and increased risk in less committed relationships.
And while men can be victims too.
Women suffer far more serious harm and are killed by partners much more often. Physically weaker family members, women, children, the elderly are generally at higher risk.
The sources connect this to a mix of factors like strong triggers, provocation, rejection.
Combined with individual factors like high trait aggressiveness, those hostile biases we discussed.
And weak inhibitors like poor self-control, maybe alcohol involved.
Exactly. It's often a perfect storm. The sources also link it to broader cultural issues like gender inequality in the SA context, where some men might feel entitled to control women and potentially failures in the justice system. The horrific practice of corrective rape is mentioned as an extreme example tied to homophobia and patriarchal violence in some SA communities.
It really highlights how it's not just individual psychology, but the whole societal context. What about the cycle of abuse?
It's mentioned. People who were abused as children are statistically more likely to become abusers themselves. But, and this is crucial, the vast majority of abuse victims do not go on to abuse others. It increases risk, but doesn't determine destiny.
And culture's role is changing here. Domestic violence used to be seen as private.
Like applying closed doors. But increasingly, culture, through laws and awareness campaigns, is saying stop. Similar to how views on hitting children have shifted dramatically over time, culture is stepping in more assertively.
Bringing that stop message into the home. Okay, another really difficult area of interpersonal aggression, sexual aggression and rape.
Yeah, using force or coercion for sex. Defining it precisely can be complex. Definitions have changed over time and vary. South Africa, for example, broadened its legal definitions significantly in 2007.
And how it's defined affects victim outcome statistics. Stranger rape versus date rape.
The sources note that violent stranger rape typically causes extremely severe, long-lasting trauma. Studies using broader definitions might capture a wider range of non-consensual acts, some resulting in less severe, though still significant, long-term harm. But any non-consensual act is a violation.
Absolutely. The sources challenge old stereotypes about rapists, right? Not just social outcasts.
Right. Research suggests sexually coercive men are often not isolated. They might have partners. Common traits can include devaluing women, low empathy, feeling betrayed by women, high sex drive, enjoyment of impersonal sex, narcissism. They often rationalize their actions, might use manipulation or alcohol alongside force, and assaults often happen after some initially consensual activity that the victim tries to stop.
And again, this links back to broader cultural issues. Patriarchal attitudes, maybe a general culture where violence is seen as a way to solve problems, noted in the essay context.
It connects to that idea of aggression as a deeply harmful strategy, enabled or even implicitly condoned within certain social and cultural settings.
Okay, we've covered internal drivers and interpersonal dynamics. Now, what about the outside world? External causes. The weapons effect sounds intriguing.
It really is. The core finding is that just the presence of a weapon can make people more aggressive, the famous Berkowitz and LePage study.
With the gun versus the badminton racket.
That's the one. Participants who were already annoyed gave more electric shocks to someone if there was a gun lying nearby, compared to when a neutral object like a racket was there. Just seeing the weapon increased aggression.
Wow. Even if they didn't use it.
Exactly. And later studies found this works even with subtle cues, like seeing weapon words flashed quickly. There was even a field study where drivers honked more aggressively at a stalled truck if it had a rifle visible in the back window.
That seems counterintuitive, honking at someone with a gun.
It does, which suggests this effect might be somewhat automatic, non-conscious. The weapon primes aggressive thoughts. It's also linked to aggressive driving enough. People who carry guns in their cars tend to report driving more aggressively.
And just holding a gun can increase those hostile biases, make you think others are armed.
Yes. The sources also point to trends like increasing gun violence in PG-13 movies, sometimes even more than R-rated ones, citing examples like the later Die Hard films and the potential impact of police militarization, like seeing heavily armed police in Ferguson or Americana, possibly increasing aggressive cues through this weapons effect.
So the visual cues themselves matter. There's a striking comparison in the sources about how quickly we recognize guns.
Yeah, as quickly as spiders or snakes, things our ancestors evolved to fear, even though guns are obviously a modern threat. And the sources contrast the actual risk. In SA, for instance, very few people die from spider or snake bites, but gun deaths are tragically common. It shows how potent this modern threat cue is.
Okay, weapons effect. Next, mass media. We know it's powerful.
Hugely powerful. The use of radio in the Rwandan genocide to actively incite violence and rape is a chilling example of its potential harm. And there's just mountains of research on media violence effects.
Things like school shootings, like Columbine, always bring up this debate.
And the sources are clear. Extreme violence like that always has multiple complex causes. You can't blame it solely on media. However, hundreds of controlled experiments provide very strong causal evidence that watching media violence does increase aggression, at least in the short term, and usually in milder forms.
So it lowers the threshold, makes people more likely to act out aggressively later.
That's the conclusion from the experimental data. And parental limits on viewing seem to help protect kids. Longitudinal studies, tracking people over years, also link heavy exposure to violent media in childhood to more aggressive behavior later in life, like criminality or spouse abuse.
What about violent video games specifically? They get a lot of attention.
Meta-analyses, which combine results from many studies, confirm they do increase aggressive thoughts, feelings, physiological arousal, and behavior. They also tend to decrease empathy and helping behavior. These effects seem pretty consistent across age, gender, and culture.
Even just playing as a violent character.
Can increase aggression, yes. And media depicting sexual violence is linked to increased aggression specifically towards women and desensitization.
So media is definitely an external factor to consider. What about just the environment around us, like unpleasant surroundings?
Absolutely. Heat is a big one. Think hot under the collar, tempers flaring.
Right.
Studies consistently find links between higher temperatures and higher rates of violence. Hotter cities, hotter seasons, even hotter days tend to have more violent crime. It's a real concern with climate change, potentially increasing conflict.
Is it just heat?
No, other unpleasant things too. Loud noise, especially noise you can't control like traffic, foul smells, secondhand smoke, air pollution. They can all make people more irritable and aggressive. There's that weird example of the woman attacking her boyfriend with a knife after he got passed wind in her face.
Wow. Okay, so intense, unpleasant stimuli can trigger extreme reactions.
Especially when combined with other factors. The sources also distinguish between density, just how many people are in a space, and crowding.
Crowding is the feeling of it being too packed.
Exactly. It's subjective and unpleasant. High density isn't always bad. Think of a fun concert. But feeling crowded in unpleasant, uncontrollable environments like prisons or maybe some under-resourced hospitals, that does reliably increase aggression.
Got it. Last external factor. Chemical influences. Hormones, drugs, diet.
Right. Inside the body, testosterone, the male sex hormone, has a well-known link to aggression. Though its complex aggression and winning can also boost testosterone.
And serotonin, the feel-good chemical.
Low levels of serotonin are linked to more aggression. It seems to work indirectly, maybe by making it harder for the brain's frontal lobes to inhibit impulsive responses. Studies manipulating tryptophan, which the body needs to make serotonin, support this.
Okay. And external substances. Alcohol is the obvious one.
Huge link. Very consistent. Armies used to give soldiers alcohol before battle for a reason makes people less fearful and more aggressive. Meta-analyses confirm alcohol causes an increase in aggression. It's not just a correlation.
Why does it have that effect?
Several reasons proposed. It lowers inhibitions, the brake line analogy. It can mess with brain glucose levels, impairing self-control. It reduces self-awareness. It disrupts higher-level thinking needed for restraint. Plus, there's the expectation effect. People think alcohol makes them aggressive, so they act that way, or use it as an excuse.
Blame the bottle.
Right. But crucially, alcohol seems to amplify aggression, mainly when there's already some other trigger, like being provoked. It doesn't necessarily make you aggressive out of the blue.
And finally, the really surprising one maybe, diet, the food for thought bit.
This is fascinating stuff. The source mentions the memoir by monster Cody Scott, linking his violent behavior partly to a terrible junk food diet. And then there's actual research, like Schoenthaler studies.
In prisons and juvenile facilities.
Yeah. In one study, just taking away fried foods and sugary stuff in a juvenile facility led to a nearly 50% drop in antisocial behavior. Giving vitamin and mineral supplements had even bigger effects in some studies, like a 2/3 reduction in violence among juveniles, or a 35% drop in rule breaking among adult prisoners.
Wow. A 2/3 reduction from vitamins? That seems almost too good to be true.
It sounds dramatic, but the results have been replicated. Dr. Gersh is quoted suggesting that maybe the decline in nutrient quality in Western diets since the mid-20th century could even correlate with rising crime rates over that period.
So the idea is poor diet messes with brain chemistry, makes people more irritable, less able to control impulses.
That seems to be the plausible mechanism. Diet obviously isn't the only cause of crime or violence, but the sources argue it might be a significant contributing factor that's often overlooked. Something as basic as what we eat could be influencing our aggression levels.
Amazing. Okay, so we've got inner factors, interpersonal dynamics, external triggers, including diet. Let's pull back again to the role of self and culture in aggression.
This really loops back to that central theme. Nature says go, culture says stop. Culture develops norms and values specifically to provide nonviolent ways to handle conflict. Its fundamental job, in this view, is to restrain aggression.
The source mentions running amok as an example of cultural framing.
Yeah, it's a term from Malaysia originally, describing sudden, violent outbursts. The point is that how cultures label and understand seemingly uncontrollable behavior can change, which itself suggests cultural influence on even our perception of control.
And self-control is key here, as the internal mechanism culture tries to build.
Hugely important. Gottfredson and Hershey's general theory of crime basically argues that low self-control is the root cause of most crime, especially violent crime. People with low self-control tend to be impulsive, seek immediate gratification, disregard rules across the board, not just criminal laws, but maybe also in things like smoking, driving recklessly, etc.
So the idea is lots of things might trigger an aggressive impulse.
But most people, most of the time, manage to stop themselves. Violence erupts when that internal self-control fails.
Culture builds the dam, self-control keeps the water back.
Right.
What about self-image? The source challenged the old idea that violent people have low self-esteem.
That's right. It's often the opposite. Research points towards inflated self-views, narcissism, feelings of superiority, entitlement, needing admiration, low empathy. Aggression, particularly violence, often comes from wounded pride.
Wounded pride.
Yeah, when that inflated sense of self gets challenged or insulted. Narcissistic individuals are hypersensitive to disrespect. So it's not feeling bad about yourself, it's feeling you're great and reacting furiously when someone questions that. Narcissism plus an insult is a potent combination for aggression in lab studies.
The insult is the trigger that bypasses the controls for someone with that inflated ego.
Exactly. Humiliation is intolerable for them, which connects to the final cultural concept, the culture of honor.
Where responding violently to insults is expected.
Or even required to maintain status and respect. The classic example is the U.S. South, historically linked to herding economies where you had to defend your reputation and property fiercely, versus the more settled farming North. Herding cultures worldwide tend to have higher violence rates.
And you see this in other places too, Latin America, the Middle East. The sources mention parts of South Africa.
Yes, elements of it can exist in various places. The key emotion is humiliation, public disgrace, loss of respect. In these cultures, violence might be seen as the necessary way to restore lost honor, different from shame, which is more internal.
That essay study about men justifying violence over infidelity to restore pride fits here.
Seems like an example of that dynamic, yes. Humiliation is even cited by some analysts as a driver of terrorism in the Middle East, or, historically, the humiliation of Germany after WWI contributing to later conflict.
Whereas the Marshall Plan after WWII focused on rebuilding dignity.
Suggesting that addressing humiliation constructively can be crucial for peace. In honor cultures, the culture says stop message gets complicated. For certain things like defending honor, culture might implicitly or even explicitly say go.
So culture itself can sometimes fuel violence in specific contexts. Okay, we focus heavily on aggression and violence, but the sources also cover other forms of antisocial behavior. Things may be less dramatic, but very common.
Definitely. Like lying. It's ubiquitous. Most people tell small lies fairly often. Though interestingly, studies suggest a huge chunk of all lies are told by a small percentage of people, habitual liars.
And lies range from tiny white lies to huge betrayals. Infidelity, political deception.
Lying to get ahead in dating is common too, exaggerating jobs, income, even appearance on profiles. In relationships, lying is often reciprocal and linked to less commitment. Trying consciously to lie less is actually linked to better health and relationships, interestingly.
But we're bad at spotting lies.
Generally, yes. Most people, even supposed experts, perform barely better than chance. Secret Service agents did a bit better in one study. Text analysis software looking at language patterns can sometimes outperform humans. Polygraphs are notoriously unreliable.
Okay, how about cheating?
Also incredibly common. Video games, sports, academics, even on free online courses, cheating rates can be high, teachers fudging grades, and the digital age makes plagiarism super easy.
Taking someone else's work and passing it off as your own happens everywhere, from schools to journalism.
Why do people do it? Not just to get ahead. There's this idea of a cheater's high, a genuine thrill some people get from getting away with it. Think Frank Abagnale, Catch Me If You Can. Causes can include weakened self-control or feeling like moral rules don't really apply.
And there's that weird link to creativity.
Yeah, recent research suggests cheating might actually boost creativity afterwards, maybe by breaking rule-following habits. But also, creative people might be better at cheating because they're good at rationalizing it. And dishonesty can even make you temporarily less aware of moral rules.
Wow, a double-edged sword there. Okay, stealing.
The big economic impact. Shoplifting and employee theft cost businesses billions. The SA shrinkage stats show they're major factors. Employee theft in the U.S. is common, sometimes linked to feeling unfairly treated. Includes stealing time, too.
And shoplifting isn't always about need. Sometimes it's the thrill.
Often, yeah. People steal things they don't even use. Identity theft is a huge modern problem causing massive disruption for victims. What increases stealing? De-individuation is a factor.
Losing yourself in a crowd. Anonymity.
Exactly. The classic study is trick-or-treaters on Halloween. Kids in anonymous costumes, especially in groups, stole way more candy than identifiable kids. Surveillance tends to reduce theft, unsurprisingly.
And posture again. Power poses.
Bizarrely, yes. Studies link adopting expansive postures, or even just sitting in a driver's seat, which encourages that, to feeling more powerful and being slightly more likely to do minor antisocial things like cheat or steal small amounts. And violent video games like Grand Theft Auto are linked to increased stealing in lab settings, too.
Okay, finally, the everyday annoyance of littering.
A persistent problem. Cigarette butts are a huge part of it. More litter attracts more litter. It's ugly, poses health risks. How to reduce it? Norms are key.
Which kinds of norms work best?
Injunctive norms, signaling what people disapprove of, usually work better than descriptive norms, just showing what people do. So a sign saying, please don't litter, is better than just seeing trash everywhere, which normalizes it. But messages that are too demanding can backfire psychological reactants. People push back against feeling controlled. Guilt helps motivate cleanup.
And recycling schemes help. Deposit systems. The SA trolleypreneurs.
Yes, creating incentives.
Yeah.
The SA plastic bag levy had some initial effect, but maybe wasn't high enough long-term as people just got used to paying it. And bags still litter. All these behaviors, lying, cheating, stealing, littering, they show that same tension. Individual impulse versus the cultural rules needed for society to function smoothly.
Wow. Okay, we have really covered a huge amount of ground. From questioning that initial feeling about violence, through definitions, the nature-nurture debate, all those different causes, internal states, interpersonal dynamics, external triggers like weapons or heat or even diet.
Right through to how culture tries to manage it all with norms and self-control, and looking at those other, maybe less dramatic but still important antisocial behaviors.
It paints a really complex picture. That core theme keeps coming back.
Yeah.
The push from our nature towards self-interest, sometimes using aggression,
That nature says go.
versus the pull from culture, developing rules, restraint, cooperation. Culture says stop. With self-control being that crucial internal battleground.
And understanding these dynamics isn't just academic. It helps make sense of big world events, crime statistics, but also, everyday conflicts, why people behave badly online. maybe even our own temptations sometimes.
Yeah, it provides a lens to look at social policy, personal choices. We saw that while those aggressive impulses seem deep-rooted, the long-term decline in extreme violence suggests culture's stop message has been surprisingly effective over time.
It's a slow, hard-won success story in many ways, built on norms, laws, institutions, socialization, all trying to channel human behavior in less harmful directions.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, thinking out everything, the definitions, history, causes, the role of pride, honor, and all those other antisocial acts, it really reinforces that core tension. The impulses are real, they're part of us.
But human culture is this incredible ongoing project to find better ways to live together.
Which leaves you with a final thought, maybe. Given how deep these impulses seem to run, how much of that progress towards less violence is down to our conscious efforts, building laws, fostering empathy, promoting self-control, versus maybe just other factors changing over time?